Thanks very much, colleagues, for joining us today in the session of the Geneva Peace Week on Inclusive Infrastructures for Peace. Very happy to be here and reflect on Johanna's example. We'll be hearing from the Minister just shortly. And we'll be hearing all of the examples from the colleagues and panelists now. Just a couple of quick opening reflections on infrastructures for peace. Why are they important now? Why are they critical around the time of COVID? I think apart from the significant and devastating health impacts of the COVID pandemic, the areas related to conflict and peace and social cohesion and civic space and the shrinking of that and the impact on peace processes are really the kinds of areas that we are looking at and want to keep in mind when we talk about infrastructures for peace in the time of COVID, of shrinking civic space. It is important that we look at the different capacities that actually exist in relation to infrastructures for peace. I'll get a little bit to the definition now. And to continue to support processes that may have been disrupted by this pandemic. Peace processes have, mediation processes have, but even regular relationship maintenance between people, either in warring contexts or in regular contexts where communities are under strain for one reason or another. It can be conflict, it can be other socioeconomic impacts, cultural impacts, political impacts, and I think we're really quite aware of that, aware of the impact of the pandemic on, broadly speaking, the field of conflict and peace building as well. One really important lesson, I think, overall from the pandemic experience is how important to continue to build capacities, particularly national and subnational and local capacities to be able to maintain good relationships that address issues of social incohesion, that addresses hate speech, misinformation, all of that, and to continue to have and operate these early warning systems that are community-based, that address the kinds of challenges that have come up because relationships have broken down, because systems have broken down, and because of the unreliability of the kinds of relationships that were impacted by COVID. And I think that's where the infrastructures for peace come in. Sometimes we hear about them as insider mediators, local peace builders, local leadership, community leadership. And I think this is really particularly important as we think about these infrastructures for peace. Infrastructures for peace to a great extent, and I think you'll hear this now, you'll certainly hear it in the case of the Philippines with Minister Sinarembo, but you will also hear it from the other colleagues. These infrastructures are sometimes brick and mortar, so they are buildings, they are sometimes institutions, and they are sometimes skills, capacities, assets, and in many cases they are relationships. They are relationships that you can rely on, they are relationships that people can rely on. They are predictable, they are sometimes tangible, and I think it's these networks of relationships and connections that are really important. So the infrastructures might appear as physical things, but in fact they are in some cases relationship-based and network based. I think the most important part of them is the reliability part, the ability to have relationships and connections that you can trust, people that you can trust. They are predictable and they appear and step in and rise at a time of heightened tension, conflict, etc. They are dynamic, they keep building, sometimes they get eroded, but I think what we will hear today from all of the panelists are some really, really bright examples of how these infrastructures can and have been maintained to a great extent at a time of terrible difficulty, sometimes conflict, but most recently in the last 1.5 years, in the context of COVID as well. We have a number of really good examples in UNDP that we have been supporting. We work through national institutions, we build national and subnational and local capacities. We work with governments, we also work with civil society, we work with broad networks like GPPAC. There have been a number of really great examples from the Philippines, like networks of women mediators. We'll hear more from the minister. In Ethiopia, we're working together with other UN entities like UNHCR to be able to build networks of people and leaders and folks that are able to address issues of violence between displaced and host communities. And in Kenya, for example, there are a number of established peace forums that encourage participation and inclusion. Infrastructures for peace, the more they are inclusive, participatory, and representative of different voices in the community, the more sustainable they are, the better lasting they are, the stronger they are. And I think the more the community actually has confidence in this. These are not substitutes. Infrastructures for peace are not substitutes for peace processes that are formal or informal. They are not substitutes for local government or governance structures, but they are effectively a contribution of the peace community to a process that is important and required. In many cases, they are bottom up. Great. They are community-based and support a broader process. In many cases, they need to be network and linked because they are so contextualized and local, and that's important, but they need to link to other contextualized and local processes as well, and they need to be coordinated one way or another. We rely on the community to coordinate this, and we do our best in UNDP to be able to support these coordination processes, sometimes with funding, sometimes with human resource capacity, sometimes with advocacy, sometimes with shining light and bringing people into spaces where they may not have before. So we really have appreciated that the work on infrastructures for peace.
I'm pleased to join the panelists for today's discussion. But towards the beginning of the mid of the 80s, there was a split inside the rebel movement in the south of the Philippines, and one of the factions that moved out of the main Moro National Liberation Front was the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. It started its negotiations in 1997. I participated in that negotiations with respect to the negotiations between the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. We were all the while thinking that after the peace agreement has been signed, the implementation would be smooth. It was a surprise, of course, for many of us to realize that the negotiations was in hindsight was easier than the implementation phase of the peace agreement. So the adjustments towards more inclusive process was a difficult transition for us. In the push for the legislation, there were a lot of interest, and that's being pushed from government, from other sectors of the society. And so we needed to make the adjustments. We were looking at allowing a more participative process in the enactment of the law, because in 2016, the law, which was supposed to be the legal framework for implementing the peace agreement, failed to pass Congress. And so we needed to rethink options available for us. Part of that was the realization that we'll have to deal with different stakeholders now, altogether, apart from just the national government. We made adjustments on how to make it more inclusive, and in the second round for pushing legislation in Congress, we've organized the insider mediation group in the Bangsamoro in our area, and we included then in this group people coming from different ethnic identities within the region. We needed to expand to look at ethnicities, gender, religious affiliation, other identities, other sectors of the society. And the platform created was a loose platform, which we call the Insider Mediation Group in the Bangsamoro. So our understanding in the group is that this will just be a platform for bringing issues and discussing it. We may not all agree on all of the issues, but what we've agreed is that once an issue is presented in the platform, we will thoroughly discuss it. We will allow everyone to express his view and his opinion. We will try to come up with a consensus. If we cannot arrive at a consensus, we will just park that issue. But it will not stop us from exploring other issues that we feel are common and important to us. So we also realize that in the lobby for the enactment of the legislation, we needed to utilize and maximize the individual networks that each of us have created over the years. Some of our colleagues are very influential in the Moro National Liberation Front. And so we tried to utilize that also in convincing the Moro National Liberation Front to agree to a power sharing arrangement. So it was a challenging task, but at the same time, we realized that when we make use of the individual connections and networks that each of us possess, we can maximize actually the result that we can produce far more than what each of us or each of our organization is capable of delivering.
Earlier in the COVID-19 pandemic, GPPAC and UNDP have focused on this very question we are discussing today. What does it really take to build an inclusive infrastructure for peace? And here you can see the 6 priorities. So it's about prioritizing building multi-stakeholder and inclusive infrastructures for peace. These include practices such as the Bow Declaration or examples from Sam and Minister. Ensuring coordination and complementary among infrastructures for peace. Where there are too many actions, it's important that mapping and coordination is done to be able to identify gaps, an example from GPPAC members in the region. Then the third priority is promoting and supporting local infrastructures for peace. So we know and speak about the need for working closely with local peace builders. So earlier this year, the UN has even launched their community engagement guidelines and civic space initiative. But the question is, do we know how? Do we do it right? And we need to see more practices of these principles really being implemented. The fourth priority is integrating principles of human security and conflict sensitivity into the work of infrastructures for peace. So it's critical to move beyond securitized approaches that are not good to people. We need to think about how we embrace the principles of dialogue and mediation embedded in peace building, as well as principles of dignity and the sanctity of human rights. And the fifth priority is ensuring adequate and quality financing for infrastructures for peace. The proposals for inclusive infrastructures for peace are as valid as the funding available for them. The financing is recently on everyone's mind with the upcoming high-level meeting on financing for peace building. However, we may need to think about is shifting in donor practices to explore more innovative approaches, not only how to get more money to work on sustaining peace, but also how to use the money that we already have and use it more innovatively with bigger impact on the field level. And then finally, the sixth priority is measuring the impact of infrastructures for peace at the local level through locally articulated methodologies. So policies at the global level are as useful as their impact to people within communities. So therefore, we should be open to flexible and locally determined ways of measuring and assessing results instead of rigid ways of measuring change in short term.
Thank you, colleagues, and greetings from Uganda. I'll share two examples, but just to start by noting that we strongly believe that infrastructures for peace need to be built in a partnership with local peace builders. The first example I can share is what we have done in one of the conflict-prone regions in Uganda, that is northeastern Uganda, called Karamoja, where we have worked with the communities to establish a number of infrastructures for peace. This includes peace committees, youth peace champions, women and women groups. We've also mobilized traditional local structures, and these structures serve to identify triggers of violence, and they are always the first responders when there is a conflict, because they are grounded in communities. And many times when a conflict happens, they are the most affected. So we really need the interventions done at community level. Unfortunately, this is where they are most lacking. Although from the experience, this is where we have recorded much of the success. So we have worked with the community, these infrastructures to build their capacity, and in turn, they are able now to go out and do campaigns, train others, mentor others, facilitate dialogues and mediation, and very many others. Why do I call it a good success story? We see that these community structures at community level, they are grounded in local knowledge. They already exist, and so it means they can be sustainable. They understand the local context. They use the local knowledge that the community understand better, and they have a lot of legitimacy and good relationships at community level. What we have only done is also to enhance these structures by creating a model which we now call the localization model that we created with GPPAC and last year, which emphasizes and guides on how to promote local ownership, active participation, building on what already exists, and contextualized interventions. So this approach is very keen promoting inclusivity. We also adopted the SDG slogan of leaving no one behind, and we always make sure that we even start with the farthest behind. So it puts the principles of active participation really in practice, including making sure that the voices of the vulnerable are heard. So we've, even from experience during the incidents now of COVID-19 pandemic, these structures have been very effective in trying to gather information, reach out to local actors, and engage them. One of the key issues they have engaged them is the nexus around human rights, peace building, and COVID-19, with the challenges we've had, especially in the militarization of the enforcement of standard operating procedures. So what do we need to do to enhance these structures? We need to build the capacity of the local, these local structures, because you can't give what you don't have. So they really need to have what it takes to be able to engage the right capacity to pass on to others, and also engage the local leaders. But also we call upon the international community, the donors. We need to ensure that we prioritize funding, especially towards local infrastructures for peace, especially at community level. And from the study we did last year, it affirms that this will ensure the effects of COVID-19 pandemic, and it is localized impact is addressed. And we also need to scale up, because what we have done is just in one of the regions, which is conflict prone, and at the moment it looks like what I would call a drop in the ocean. So we are hoping that we can do more with a number of other development actors and experts. Another level, apart from the community level, at another level is at national level, where we now engage governments. At the moment, we are advocating and engaging the government at central level, to develop a national peace policy, which can provide a systematic guidance and coordination for implementation of peace building efforts. Because one of the challenges we have is that the absence of this peace policy as an infrastructure for peace makes the actors be able to respond in an ad hoc manner. And when they do, what usually happens is that the responses are mainly reactionary, but we always try to emphasize the preventative measures which the framework can provide. And this one, we as civil society and other local peace builders can be a tool as a basis for engagement and advocacy. So around this, we hope that what needs to be done then is to work with the peace builders at local level, with actors at national level and the international community to be able to enhance the localization model, which really ensures the active engagement of communities to shape the agenda, to articulate their needs and put them in a good contextualized intervention framework. Then, of course, we need to build the capacity of communities to be able to be aware and be able to engage, and also strengthen the conflict early warning and response mechanisms. Because we have them, but they are still weak. And many times the response part is most lacking. Even when there is early warning, but the early response is often lacking. And we all need to prioritize investment in infrastructures for peace, especially in conflict prevention. From experience, we believe that this is the most effective and indeed the most cost-effective means of addressing conflicts and sustaining peace and the structures for peace at community level and at national level.
Very, very warm greetings from Nepal. And I'm very happy as a peace practitioner to join this Geneva Peace Week on inclusive infrastructures for peace, focusing on global policies and actions on the ground. Before going to the CEDAW mechanism, as a civil society activist, may I just focus a little bit, give you some remarks on, as a civil society, considering the global policy, I think the Security Council Resolution 1325, how certain countries used it very effectively to strengthen advocacy for governments to develop inclusive infrastructures for peace. In the context of Nepal, the National Action Plan was developed in 2010, based on the advocacy given by the mandate of 1325, which actually resulted in having formulating local peace committees with a mandatory condition of it being inclusive in terms of also including conflict-affected women and girls. There was 33% and all that. So that was where we could say about locally informed solutions that could be brought up. The other mechanism was a localization guideline, because at the central level in the government, you could have a very great national action plan, but if it is not localized, if it does not touch the local people's lives, then it is of no use. So there was a localization guideline as well. And the other infrastructure was, we had a special ministry of peace and reconstruction headed by a woman initially as a deputy prime minister. There were other ministers as well later. But there was a high-level steering committee for the implementation of Women, Peace, Security agenda. And because of the advocacy provided, we had 40% women's organizations represented in this high-level steering committee. So all this led to some level of inclusive infrastructures for peace based on the mandate provided by the Security Council resolution. But the biggest gap that many say, and I was one of the key drafters of the National Action Plan, but the biggest gap that local women asked me several times was, if our government does not implement the plan, then what actions can be taken against the government, where we had no answers, So it was in that regard, I remember also being engaged for the advocacy for General Recommendation 30 of CEDAW, which brought the state parties under the purview of having to obligatorily report to CEDAW in terms of what they have done under women, peace, and security. So there was a very wide range of advocacy for that, and the general recommendation was adopted by the CEDAW committee in 2013, when I was not a member of the CEDAW committee. So I was engaged in all this. I've been a member of the CEDAW committee since 2017, and this is my second mandate. I'm happy to say that I have been the chair of the Task Force on Women, Peace and Security, implementing GR 30, and I'm still the focal person for women, peace and security. What I find as a practitioner of peace, as a civil society, and considering the shrinking space of civil society, what gives me some gratification is that we have been attempting to build the accountability of member states on developing inclusive infrastructures for peace by including in a constructive dialogue, whether they have, if the countries are emerging from conflict or are in conflict, whether they have a national action plan, if they have a national action plan or developing a national action plan, how are the civil society, particularly women's organizations, going to be involved in it? What kind of roles and responsibilities will be given? What is the funding mechanism? How much of allocation of budget will be there? What are the capacities? Also about monitoring and evaluation. So these are the questions that are addressed during the constructive dialogue, and so included in the recommendations given to governments as well, based on the dialogue that takes place. But coming to locally informed solutions, this process has also enabled civil society to provide alternative reports on women, peace and security that the CEDAW committee is informed about. And most of these reports are based on, experiences of conflict affected women and girls and how it has affected them. So that has enriched our dialogue, and has helped us to build the accountability of state parties, because in the last, I did a gist on 2018 and 19. If I look at it, there has been an increase of 40% member states reporting on women, peace and security with a specific title, women, peace and security. So we are gradually trying to build this process of strengthening accountability for developing inclusive infrastructures for peace. So I will stop here. As a CEDAW mechanism, I think this has been one of the most powerful mechanisms. Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. It's been very, very fascinating to listen to all of you. And I think it really gives a sense of where we are able to facilitate, to nurture, to support beyond the bottlenecks, and to have a sense of how to provide and support agency among actors. So I think this is a wonderful, appropriate space to share. I'm very grateful to be part of this this panel. So thank you for the opportunity. I think here in Maldives, the UN has obviously a very strong support program to the government directly around areas relating to climate change, around areas relating to governance, in a political transition that started about 13 years ago, when a new constitution was drawn up. A decade and a bit, some people would say, well, it's a middle-income country. What is the real need for kind of setting up and supporting infrastructures for peace? But I think we will all agree that I think every society has its challenges, every society has its fractures and its tension points. And some of these here are indeed social, some of them are indeed political, some of them relate to gender and the role of women. And some of it are really about the role of youth as well. So I think the examples that I wanted to share today are really relating more around women and youth, and the fact that despite the best efforts of the government and despite existing programs within the UN, it's still recognized that some of the issues that need to come to the fore are as yet not explored enough. Part of my role as a Peace and Development Advisor, which is run through the joint program of the Department of Peacebuilding and Political Affairs, UNDP, and the Resident Coordinator's Office here in Maldives, is really to look at providing that support and being catalytic in the process. So one of the big challenges faced, I think, here is around girls and women participation, where there are these contrasts depending on the island or the institution. And I was approached by the captain of the national football team, national women's football team, who I think felt that they could do more to help to enhance the conversation. And in our discussions, we were able to bring the former coach, football coach, and my role really was to support them in designing a way in which sport and football specifically could provide that platform for conversations around the role of girls and women and building their voice and having them amplify their voices. The training camp that was set up in the south of the country, so away from the capital, helped provide support to both boys and girls, which is unusual. Very often there's this kind of a segregation between the genders in sport, and run by the national women's football team. I think that provided a very new and refreshing angle. Parents attended, teachers attended. So again, this kind of cross-fertilization in the experience, I think was very important. But beyond that, I think the one very exciting and refreshing part of the design that came from the coach and the captain and team members was to provide evening panels around the schools within the area where the platform was set up, the training platform. And this panel was really intended to provide the opportunity for girls, boys, teachers, parents to ask questions directly to the football team. An opportunity that very rarely comes up, and an opportunity that was actually very much more exciting because not only were they football players, but there were also many of them personalities in their own rights. One was a film star, very well known. Others were holding various professional ranks in the police or in various other professional areas. So I think across the board, it provided a very interesting moment in which those difficult questions that people would like to ask and rarely had the opportunity to ask actually now presented itself. And we had extraordinary conversations in the space provided by the schools in the evening with a very large audience of young people, really talking about the role of women in sport, professional attitudes, challenges faced by women in sport, and so on. Beyond that, of course, that amplified more broadly challenges that women are facing professionally in Maldives and of course globally. So I think the whole area that was created, the space that was created, was a very safe space. It was a very intimate space where children felt comfortable to ask questions. And in the end, it became a very, very powerful dialogue that was then captured for television and then televised nationally. So I think, unusual, unexpected, perhaps, but I think a very nice way in which sport has become a vehicle for a platform. The second example, and I'll be very brief, is again looking at another vehicle, also not your regular vehicle, but the arts and the role of theatre. Some of you may have heard theatre of the oppressed, playback theatre. These are all methodologies that have provided spaces for people to not only reflect on who they are, but also to reflect on who people are as a group, and then to take ideas that are generated in that group in a safe space where they're trained and facilitated out onto a roadshow, as happened in Maldives. So a group of young people who had never met each other really came together and used the space of the National Gallery, which was lent to us very kindly, and with the very, very adept support of an expert in theatre of the oppressed, these young people started to explore not only their individuality, but also their commonality. Men, women, obviously different persuasions, different ideologies. And in that process of unpacking who they were as individuals and as a collective, they started to look at issues, societal issues that have been impacting them. This then formed the backbone of a short piece of theatre that they put together under the support of the expert, and it was then played in the cinema here in the capital to an audience. And the idea basically is that the piece, a very short piece of about 5 or 6 minutes, is played to the audience, and then it's played a second time, obviously with an explanation to the audience that the second time round they can stop the piece of theatre any point by raising their hand and take the place of one of the actors and then generate how they think the dialogue could have gone in their own mind. This then produced a series of interventions from the floor, which then led to the person who was facilitating that whole piece to then ask why people decided to choose that specific intervention. And without knowing it, people were then pulled into a really important dialogue about some of the most sensitive issues in society in the Maldives of the day. This then went on a tour around the islands and became a very powerful tool, recognized both by government, Ministry of Arts and Culture, by the UN, because of course the UN also was faced with a number of challenges about how to tackle very sensitive issues. And communities felt really engaged and drawn into these pieces of theatre and saw their young people speaking out to them. So I think in a nutshell, rather large nutshell, I think sometimes it's the unusual methods that provide a platform which doesn't always exist when we look at, for example, local government or at regular spaces and infrastructures. I think it really is looking into sustainability of these kind of initiatives and building them up and augmenting them so that they can actually impact a larger number of people over time.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that from the CRIES and GPPAC Latin America Caribbean experience, ever since the beginning, so over 15 years ago, we've emphasized trying to integrate a diversity of civil society organizations and individuals that at many times weren't working specifically from a peace building perspective. And from the beginning, especially in the cases of, for example, Central America, we had a lot of members towards the network that were really focused on human rights policy. And that's particularly relevant in the case of Central America because it has had a broad history of human rights violations, mass human rights violations. And they brought to the table perspectives that sometimes, they came into a bit of a contradiction regarding the strategies that sometimes the people coming from the peace building field wanted to implement. And over time, I think that on a global level, we've seen those discussions are being bridged and that gap is being closed. And now we find a lot more commonalities in the discourse, a lot more commonalities in the strategies that we want to implement. But at the same time, it was part of the difficulties we were confronting. What happened over time is that a lot of the funding that was oriented towards peace building and conflict prevention initiatives in Latin America and the Caribbean started to run a bit dry, with specific cases in which this was not true. For example, Colombia has historically been a bit more prone towards these initiatives, but the rest of the region was having these difficulties. And here, what we found was very useful is that bringing in the mass atrocity prevention lens and having discussions relating also to responsibility to protect, for example, and really thinking about things like upstream prevention helped us tie in these agendas. And on one side, I think it strengthened the capabilities of civil society working on the ground, whether it's locally, nationally, or sub-regionally. At the same time, it facilitated access to funding that was being oriented towards mass atrocity prevention initiatives in a moment where conflict prevention was not necessarily at the top of the agenda for many donors. And this really strengthened or allowed for these organizations that in the past had focused on conflict prevention to kind of amplify and widen their agenda in order to include these perspectives coming from the mass atrocity prevention field, and continue to do really good work, especially with the focus on upstream prevention. And now we're seeing that, you know, upstream prevention is becoming quite mainstream in the discussions that are being had across the region. I think that the mass atrocity prevention lens has contributed in strengthening the capacities of organizations working across Latin America and the Caribbean, and has integrated these fields that for a long time maybe were even competing, and now they're becoming increasingly complementary. And we're finding that there's a proliferation of initiatives that, you know, include human rights organizations, include conflict prevention oriented organizations, include organizations that have focused on development issues, on issues of migration, on issues of climate change, right? And these networks at the same time have become increasingly important to support the work of all of these organizations. You know, strong regional networks contribute enormously to the individual efforts of organizations and individuals working across the region. And one example that comes to mind right away is the initiative that we have been supporting over the last 2 years. It's called Citizens Bridges, and it's between civil society organizations on both sides of the Colombia-Venezuela border. And these organizations, they're trying to overcome what has become a huge issue for communities in both countries, which is the closing down of the border and the increasing and escalation of offensive and hostile political discourse between the governments of the two countries, right? In a region where historically that border was profoundly integrated and where people living on that border were very accustomed to being able to cross from one side of the other to conduct business or on the border without major problems, right? And now it has become a focus of international conflictivity. It has become a focus for illegal and illicit groups operating in that area and conducting illicit activities as well. So this gathering of civil society organizations and individuals, in large part based on this pre-existing integration of civil society organizations from Latin America and the Caribbean, has helped create the conditions for that specifically focused Citizens Bridges initiative that contributes in such a way to reestablish dialogues across the border in a moment where, well, that dialogue seems to be fading quite rapidly. One last thing that I would highlight in terms of policy and that I think is quite relevant is that there is a need to think about how do we orient resources towards these organizations. And I think that their organizations that are working at a regional and a national level have a responsibility to look for ways to ensure that the funding that they have access to, many times because they have the bureaucratic and administrative capability to look for funding outside of the region, to ensure that people that are working at a national, subnational, and local level do have access to that funding, right? Whether it's through re-granting mechanisms, whether it's through joint applications for funding. And that's something that we have been working with in the last year or so, and it has worked out quite well. Smaller grants to smaller organizations that are working on the ground has led to excellent outputs. And in the times of, you know, what was mentioned before at the beginning of the session regarding this COVID context, reduction of civic spaces, this has become particularly important to ensure that at least a lifeline is established with the NGOs that are working on the ground.
What I have are 11 points that I think are very, very important for the prevention, the peace building community to take out from this particular session, which I'd like to share here. Maybe some people will take those as recommendations, lessons learned, ways forward, but I think they're very important to highlight and conclude as well. 2 or 3 first points come from the Philippines example, and I think they're very important. That this inclusion comes from the need of the community on the basis of particular needs, socioeconomic, political, cultural, and others, really is the driver behind inclusion. This is not a gratuity. This is not generosity on the part of people at the table to bring others, but it actually is a need, and it's good for the inclusive process of infrastructures for peace. The minister reminded us that that an infrastructure for peace can be written into law, needs to be written into law. So inclusion is not only brick and mortar as a building, is not only a set of relationships, but to structure and make that sustainable, it actually then becomes part of the legal process, part of the law, for the structure to hold in the future. I think that's a really important point as well. And that thirdly, infrastructures for peace are not an organizational substitute. Everyone has certain allegiances, alliances, comes from a particular background, and they don't leave that behind when they join a new part, nor do we actually need to create new structures, but rather add, complement, strengthen our own processes by being part of others as well. I think we heard on a couple of different occasions opportunities on how to maximize individual engagements, and how individual engagements, individual work, individual insider mediators are able to aggregate well beyond the work that is being done. And I think we heard on a couple of occasions this idea of greater than the sum of the parts. Individual initiatives, individual organizations, by working together, they aspire to become something much bigger than just having local level results. And I think that's a really important point as well that came out. I think one other thing that came out, which is also important, partly in relation to the insider mediators discussion, is that the first impacted are also the first responders. And that, I think, brings out quite a responsibility on our part to be able to support more and more members of the community. For those in the peace building field, this is the move from not only key people to more people. The more people that we actually have to multiply this work, it'll be great as well. I think we heard on a couple of occasions, particularly from Nepal, how to think about infrastructures for peace as policy. And I think this came out also in the last point that I mentioned as well, which is how to start aggregating upwards. We do a lot of horizontal network building, connecting people horizontally to each other, organizations horizontally to each other, but figuring out how a local peace community becomes part of a national peace policy, and how to support that level of coordination vertically, I think is really quite important, and certainly came out quite strongly as well. I think one of the interesting points that we don't really think about, but I think came out quite clearly as well, not only in the building national capacities part, which Patrick mentioned as well, but I think Bandana made an important point, which is this accountability part. So you build a structure, and then you get to the point where you want that structure to be maintained, and you want there to be accountability for maintaining it as well. This is everyone's responsibility, whether it's government, whether it's civil society as well. We think of the NGOization of the field of peace, but I think Ferdinand, peace and peace building, but Ferdinand and Patrick as well, when they spoke about women, young boys and girls, spoke about different spaces in which we can actually look at infrastructures for peace, creative spaces, social spaces, clubs, informal engagements, football or soccer. Ferdinand is an important space in which young people, I think, of different backgrounds come together and become part of an infrastructure for peace as well. Theater of the oppressed, and the arts, I think, has been a particularly important space. And if you think about how critical for peace education is, culture is, these are spaces that are explored as well. I really appreciated how Andre closed as well with reframing and using different lenses for finding opportunities for the engagement. If in some cases the contradiction, sometimes real, sometimes not real, between human rights and peace is the problem, then finding another way to address these things is critical. Using the lens of responsibility to protect, I think has been interesting, continues to be interesting as well. And I think one of the big areas that comes up in that is this being able to better use social capital. In that case, the vertical, in that case, the linking type of social capital, where initiatives at a community level, at a country level, start getting connected to the national level, and in some cases to the global and international level. GPPAC does that quite well by being a network of networks that connect people, certainly horizontally, but also vertically as well. I think lastly, everyone's example basically related to the resilience of infrastructures for peace when they are inclusive. Things are getting difficult, situations are getting difficult. We are surprised by multiple crises and challenges happening at the same time, all of which impact peace and people's social cohesion and the relationships to each other, whether it's climate change and the risks induced by that or coming out from that, or pandemics, or cross-border issues that we are not accustomed to dealing with quite openly, or borders that close, as in the case, the really good example on citizen bridges, where communities still have to find opportunities. I think being able to have infrastructures for peace that are flexible, resilient, adapting is really quite important. Again, these are not really recommendations, but great takeaways that we certainly took from some of these discussions.